The year is 1953. The place is a small village in North Korea, 40 miles behind enemy lines. A man walks through the village square. He wears a Chinese People's Volunteer Army officer's uniform. The villagers bow respectfully as he passes. Children wave. An old woman offers him rice. But this man is not Chinese. His name is Captain James William Morrison, United States Air Force, and for the past 8 months, he has been living a lie so dangerous that one mistake, one mispronounced word, one moment of forgetfulness would mean his execution. This is the story the Pentagon kept classified until 1994. This is the story his own children didn't know until their father's funeral. This is the story of how an American pilot survived behind enemy lines by becoming the enemy himself. But it all started with a split-second decision at 15,000 feet when everything James Morrison thought he knew about survival was about to be proven wrong. June 17, 1952, above the Yalu River, North Korea. Temperature, 32 degrees Fahrenheit at altitude. Captain James Morrison was flying his 73rd combat mission. His F-86 Sabre screamed through the morning sky, part of a 4-plane formation hunting for MiG-15s near the Chinese border. Jim Morrison was 28 years old, born in Cedar Rapids, Iowa, high school football captain, married his sweetheart Betty 2 weeks before shipping out to Korea. She was pregnant with their first child, a child he had never seen because little Sarah was born 3 months after he deployed to Korea. 73 missions, just 7 more until his rotation home.
Able Leader, this is Able 3. I've got bogeys at 2 o'clock high. 4? No, 6 of them. The radio crackled in Morrison's ears. His wingman, Lieutenant Pete Donovan from Brooklyn, had spotted them first. 6 MiG-15s dropping out of the sun like silver daggers. What happened next occurred in seconds, but Morrison would replay it in slow motion for the rest of his life. The MiGs dove. The American formation broke. The sky became a tangle of contrails and tracer fire. Morrison latched onto a MiG, followed it through a vertical climb, squeezed the trigger. His .50 caliber rounds tore into the MiG's fuselage. The enemy plane began trailing smoke. But Morrison had made a mistake. He'd followed his target too far north, too far from his squadron, and in the chaos of the dogfight, he hadn't noticed the MiG approaching from his 6 o'clock position. The first burst of cannon fire shredded his left wing. The second destroyed his hydraulics. The stick went dead in Morrison's hands. Able Leader, this is Able 3. I'm hit bad. Able 3, get out! Eject! Eject! But Morrison didn't eject. Not yet. Because through his canopy, he could see where he was. He was 40 miles into North Korean territory, 40 miles behind enemy lines. If he ejected here, if he parachuted down into this landscape of mountains and villages, his life expectancy would be measured in hours.
The Sabre was falling now, spinning, altitude bleeding away. 10,000 feet, 9,000, 8,000. Morrison fought the stick. Nothing. The plane was a coffin, tumbling toward Earth. 7,000 feet. His hand moved to the ejection handles between his legs. Standard procedure. Eject, parachute down, evade, escape. That's what the training said. That's what every manual said. 6,000 feet. But something in Morrison's mind was calculating different odds. If I eject here, they'll see my parachute. They'll be waiting when I land. I'll be captured in minutes, interrogated, probably executed. 5,000 feet. The plane's spin was slowing. The ground was rushing up, but Morrison could see features now. A river, hills, and there, a narrow valley running east to west. 4,000 feet. His hands moved not to the ejection handles, but back to the stick. The hydraulics were dead, but the mechanical linkages might still respond. He pulled. Nothing. Pulled harder. The nose moved, slightly. 3,000 feet. This is insane, Morrison whispered to himself. But he kept pulling. 2,000 feet. The Sabre's nose came up. Not much, not enough for a landing, but enough to turn a vertical crater into a survivable crash.
1,000 feet. Morrison could see individual trees now. He could see a rice paddy. He could see the valley floor rushing up at 300 miles per hour. 500 feet. Betty, he whispered, thinking of his wife, Sarah. And then Captain James Morrison did something that no one in the Pentagon thought was possible. He crash-landed a crippled F-86 Sabre behind enemy lines and walked away from it. The impact was like being inside a car crash and a train wreck simultaneously. The Sabre's belly hit the rice paddy at a slight angle, throwing up a fountain of water and mud. The plane skipped once, twice, then plowed through the soft earth like a bullet through flesh. Morrison's head snapped forward against his chest straps. His vision went white, then black, then white again. When the world stopped moving, he was hanging upside down in his harness. The canopy was shattered. Cold water was seeping into the cockpit. And in the sudden silence after the roar of the crash, he could hear something terrifying. Voices. Shouting. Getting closer. Morrison's hands moved on instinct. Release harness. Fall. Ignore the pain. Climb out of cockpit. Run. He tumbled out of the wrecked Sabre into knee-deep water. His flight suit was soaked. His helmet was gone, lost in the crash. Blood ran down his face from a cut above his eyebrow. The voices were louder now. Morrison looked up and saw them. A dozen men, maybe more, running down the hillside toward the crash site. Farmers probably, but they would have weapons. They would capture him. They would turn him over to the North Korean army. Morrison ran. He splashed through the rice paddy, fell, got up, fell again. His ribs screamed, probably broken. His left ankle felt wrong, but adrenaline kept him moving. He reached the edge of the paddy and plunged into the forest. Behind him, the shouts grew louder. They'd reached the plane. They'd seen him run. They were following. Morrison crashed through underbrush, branches whipping his face. He had no weapon. His service pistol had been torn from his holster in the crash. He had no supplies, no map, no compass, just his brain and his body, and the clothes on his back. He ran for 20 minutes, maybe longer, until his lungs were burning and his legs were rubber. Then he found a dense thicket of bushes, crawled inside, and lay perfectly still. The voices passed by, close, so close he could hear their breathing. They were searching methodically, spreading out through the forest, but they missed him. After an hour, the voices faded. After 2 hours, silence returned to the forest. Captain James Morrison lay in the bushes and took inventory of his situation. He was 40 miles behind enemy lines in North Korea. He had no weapon, no supplies, no way to contact friendly forces. The nearest American position was 2 days' march through enemy territory, if he even knew which direction to go. Standard military doctrine was clear: evade and escape, move at night, hide during the day, head south toward the front lines. But Morrison had flown over this terrain dozens of times. He knew what was out there. The hills were crawling with North Korean and Chinese troops. The roads had checkpoints every few miles. Patrols were constant. The odds of successfully evading capture while traveling 40 miles south were essentially zero.
So as the sun began to set on that June evening in 1952, Captain James Morrison made the second decision that would define the rest of his life. He decided not to run south toward American lines. Instead, he decided to hide in plain sight. Morrison spent that first night in the forest, shivering in his wet flight suit, his mind racing through impossible plans. He had noticed something during his months flying over North Korea. The Chinese People's Volunteer Army, the volunteers China had sent to support North Korea, were everywhere, hundreds of thousands of them. And in the chaos of this massive military operation, individual soldiers often moved between units, between villages, between assignments. Morrison spoke no Chinese, he spoke no Korean, but he had something else. He had observed these soldiers from the air, had seen their movements, their patterns, and he had one advantage that seemed both absurd and potentially life-saving. He looked Chinese. Well, not exactly. Morrison's mother was Scottish-Irish. His father was complicated. His father, John Morrison, had been born in San Francisco's Chinatown in 1908 to a Chinese immigrant mother and an Irish father. Growing up, Jim Morrison had inherited his grandfather's broad build and his father's height, but his facial features had come from his grandmother. Flatter nose, epicanthic folds, dark hair, darker complexion than most Iowans. In Cedar Rapids, this had made him exotic, different. The other kids had called him names sometimes. Chinaman Jim, half-breed. It had hurt. He learned to ignore it, to prove himself on the football field, to be more American than anyone else. But here, behind enemy lines, that same face might save his life.
The plan that formed in Morrison's mind that first night was insane. Suicidal, really. But it was the only plan he had. Over the next 3 days, Morrison became a ghost in the forest. He watched. He learned. He observed Chinese soldiers moving along the road. He studied their uniforms, their weapons, their body language. He noticed that officers walked with a certain bearing, straight backs, heads up. He noticed that lower-ranked soldiers often looked tired, hungry, their uniforms poorly maintained. On the 4th day, Morrison made his move. There was a small Chinese supply depot in a village 3 miles from where he'd crashed. He'd watched it for 2 days. 6 soldiers guarded it, but they were lazy, complacent. This far from the front lines, they felt safe. Morrison waited till just before dawn, when the guards were drowsiest. He crept into the storage area of the depot, and there, hanging on a line to dry, he found what he needed: a Chinese People's Volunteer Army uniform. Size too small, but it would work, and a cap and boots. He also found something else: a satchel containing papers, identity documents, supply requisitions, travel orders. He couldn't read them, they were in Chinese, but he understood their value. Morrison stripped off his flight suit, buried it in the forest, and put on the Chinese uniform. The transformation was physical, but also mental. He straightened his back. He adopted the blank expression he'd seen on the faces of soldiers moving through villages. And then, Captain James Morrison of the United States Air Force walked out of the forest and onto a road where Chinese soldiers were moving north. No one stopped him. No one questioned him. He simply joined the flow of traffic, one more anonymous soldier in an army of thousands.
The first test came within an hour. A Chinese officer on horseback rode past Morrison's position on the road. The officer glanced at him. Morrison snapped to attention and saluted, the way he'd seen lower-ranked soldiers do. The officer nodded and rode past. Morrison's heart was hammering so hard he thought it might burst through his chest, but his face remained blank. His body remained still. He had passed. Over the next week, Morrison perfected his disguise. He learned to walk like the other soldiers, a slight shuffle, head down, conserving energy. He learned to avoid eye contact with officers. He learned which gestures meant yes and which meant no without understanding the words. Most importantly, he learned to be invisible. Not literally, he was clearly visible, but socially invisible. Just another tired soldier in a sea of tired soldiers. The war had been going on for 2 years by this point. The Chinese army was exhausted. Men were dying of disease and starvation as often as from combat. Officers didn't scrutinize every private's face. They didn't have time. They had quotas to meet, positions to hold, wars to fight. Morrison used this chaos to his advantage. When other soldiers tried to speak to him, he would cough, gesture to his throat, indicating illness. Most moved away quickly. No one wanted to catch whatever disease the foreign-looking soldier might have. At night, when units gathered for meals or briefings, Morrison would position himself at the edges. He would hold a bowl of rice like everyone else. He would nod when others nodded. He would stand when they stood.
And slowly, day by day, mile by mile, Morrison moved north, away from the front lines, deeper into North Korea, toward areas where fewer troops congregated, where he might find a place to hide long term. Because Morrison had realized something crucial. He couldn't escape. The border was too far, too heavily guarded. The coast was blocked. Going south toward American lines would get him killed. His only chance was to disappear, to become Chinese, to wait out the war, however long that took. On the 18th day after his crash, Morrison arrived in the village of Hoi Ring, 15 miles from the Chinese border. This village would be his home for the next 8 months. Hoi Ring was a small village that had been swollen by war. Before 1950, maybe 300 people lived there. By the summer of 1952, it housed over 2,000, mostly Chinese soldiers rotating off the front lines for rest and resupply. Morrison had chosen Hoi Ring carefully. It was large enough that one more foreign face wouldn't stand out, but small enough that it wasn't strategically important. No high-ranking officers stationed themselves here. No foreign journalists, just exhausted soldiers, local farmers forced to house them, and the grinding machinery of war. Morrison needed an identity. The papers he'd stolen from the supply depot were for a private Chen Wei, 23 years old, from Sichuan province. The real Chen Wei was probably dead, killed in combat or disease. His papers ended up in a supply depot, waiting to be filed away or destroyed. Now, those papers belonged to Morrison. Chen Wei reported to the local garrison commander, a Captain Zhao, who was more interested in his rice wine than in tracking individual soldiers. Zhao glanced at Morrison's papers, nodded, and assigned him to the supply detail. This was exactly what Morrison wanted. Supply soldiers didn't fight. They didn't go on patrols. They organized food distribution, managed equipment, loaded trucks. It was boring work, low visibility work, perfect for a man trying to be invisible.
Morrison's days fell into a routine. 5 a.m., wake-up call, stand for morning formation with other soldiers, nod during the political briefings he couldn't understand. 6 a.m., breakfast, thin rice porridge, sometimes with vegetables. Morrison learned to eat slowly to make the meager portions last. 7 a.m., work detail, unloading supply trucks, counting rice bags, organizing equipment, physical work that required no language skills. Noon, lunch break, more rice. Morrison would sit slightly apart from the others, his cough still his excuse for silence. 1 p.m., more work. The monotony was actually comforting. No one asked complicated questions during manual labor. 6 p.m., dinner, rice and sometimes meat. Morrison was always hungry. The rations were barely enough for men doing hard physical labor. 7 p.m., evening free time. This was the dangerous period. This was when soldiers gathered to talk, to share stories from home, to complain about officers. Morrison had to be careful. He developed a persona. Chen Wei was quiet, serious, not unfriendly, but not social. He had a cough that came and went. He was from Sichuan, which was far away. If anyone asked about his hometown, he could claim they wouldn't know it. He was literate enough to read basic supply documents, but not educated enough to draw attention. And Morrison had one advantage: his face. Whatever made him look different in Iowa made him fit in here. Not perfectly. There were differences, subtle tells that a careful observer might notice. But in the chaos of war, with thousands of men from dozens of provinces, his face was just another face.
The hardest part wasn't the physical work or the constant danger of discovery. The hardest part was the loneliness. At night, lying on his thin mat in the barracks he shared with 30 other men, Morrison would think about Betty, his wife, his high school sweetheart, the girl who'd worn his letter jacket, the woman he'd married in a small church in Cedar Rapids with both their families watching. He wondered if she thought he was dead. The Air Force would have told her that his plane went down behind enemy lines, no parachute observed, no rescue possible. Missing in action, presumed dead. Was she mourning him? Was she raising their daughter alone? Had she moved on? And Sarah, his daughter, born 3 months after he deployed. He'd seen exactly 2 photographs mailed to him at the airbase. A tiny wrinkled face, Betty's nose, his dark hair. Sarah would be 9 months old now. She'd be sitting up, maybe crawling, maybe saying her first words. She would never know her father. Even if Morrison survived this, even if he somehow made it home, how could he explain? How could he tell anyone what he was doing? These thoughts tormented him, but he couldn't let them show on his face. Chen Wei didn't have an American wife. Chen Wei didn't have a baby daughter. Chen Wei was just another soldier,
far from home, waiting for the war to end. Morrison developed coping mechanisms. He would count in English silently in his head. Numbers were safe. Numbers were pure. 1, 2, 3, 4. Sometimes he'd count to 1,000 before he fell asleep.
He would recite the Lord's Prayer, the words his mother had taught him. Our Father, who art in heaven. But he had to be careful. If he mumbled in his sleep, if he said English words, someone might hear. He would replay memories like movies in his mind. His first date with Betty, the county fair, cotton candy, the Ferris wheel, his high school graduation, his first solo flight in training. Good memories, memories of being James Morrison, not Chen Wei. But he had to be careful with these mental escapes, because the longer he stayed in character, the more Chen Wei felt real and James Morrison felt like the pretender. 3 months into his time in Hoiryong, Morrison made a friend. This wasn't planned. Friendship was dangerous. Friendship meant conversation, questions, intimacy. But it happened anyway. His name was Liu, Private Liu Shen, from Guangdong Province. He was 20 years old, thin as a reed, with a quick smile and sad eyes. Liu worked in a supply depot too. He'd been assigned to Morrison's work detail, and over weeks of working side by side, Liu had started treating Morrison's cough as a real illness rather than a reason to avoid him. One evening, Liu brought Morrison a cup of hot tea. "For your throat," Liu said, in Chinese, gesturing. Morrison nodded, taking the tea. He was careful to show gratitude, but not to speak. But Liu sat down next to him, and Liu began to talk.
Liu talked about his home in Guangdong, about his mother who made the best dumplings in their village, about his younger sister who was smart, who should have gone to university but couldn't because of the war, about his father who died when Liu was 12. Morrison couldn't respond with words, but he could listen, and he discovered that listening was its own form of communication. He would nod at the right moments. He would smile slightly when Liu told a funny story. He would look sad when Liu talked about missing home. And Liu seemed to appreciate this. "You're a good listener, Chen Wei," Liu said once. "Most men only want to talk about themselves." Morrison felt a surge of guilt. Liu thought they were friends. Liu was trusting him, and it was all based on a lie. But Morrison needed this. He needed this small connection, even if it was false, because the alternative, complete isolation, would drive him insane. Over the following months, Morrison and Liu developed a strange friendship. Liu would talk. Morrison would listen. Liu would share his meager food rations. Morrison would help Liu with difficult work tasks. And slowly, Morrison began to understand Chinese. Not fluently, he could never speak it, couldn't risk revealing his American accent, but he could understand context, could pick out key words, could follow the general meaning of conversations around him. This made him more effective at being invisible. He knew when to nod, knew when to laugh, knew when to look serious. But it also made his situation more dangerous, because understanding the language meant understanding what was being said about the war, about American soldiers, about what would happen to spies if they were caught.
Morrison had several close calls during his 8 months in Hoiryong. The first came in September 1952, 3 months after his arrival. A new officer was assigned to the garrison, Major Wang, who had a reputation for being thorough. Wang was conducting inspections of all personnel, reviewing everyone's papers, checking backgrounds. Morrison knew this was dangerous. His papers were real. They belonged to the real Chen Wei, but they wouldn't hold up under intense scrutiny. If Major Wang checked with Chen Wei's home unit, if he has detailed questions about Sichuan province, if he noticed the subtle differences in Morrison's appearance. The inspection was scheduled for a Tuesday morning. Morrison spent the previous night preparing. He memorized the few facts he knew about Sichuan province. He rehearsed answers to potential questions in his mind, answers he'd have to communicate through gestures and written notes. When Tuesday came, Morrison stood in formation with the other soldiers. Major Wang walked down the line, stopping at each man, reviewing papers, asking questions. Morrison's heart pounded. His palms were sweating, but his face remained blank. Major Wang stopped in front of him, looked at his papers, looked at his face. "Chen Wei, from Sichuan." Morrison nodded. "You've been quiet since you arrived. The commander tells me you have a throat ailment?"
Morrison nodded again, gesturing to his throat, coughing slightly. Major Wang frowned. He looked at Morrison more carefully, too carefully. "There's something," Major Wang began. And then Liu stepped forward. "Major, permission to speak," Liu said. Major Wang turned. "What is it, Private?"
Chen Wei saved my life last month, sir. A supply truck was unloaded improperly. Crates were falling. He pushed me out of the way, took the impact himself, injured his throat. He hasn't been able to speak since." This was completely false. No such incident had happened. But Liu was vouching for Morrison, lying for him. Major Wang looked between Liu and Morrison, and he nodded. Very well. Dismissed. Morrison had passed because of Liu, because of friendship based on lies. That night, Morrison wanted to thank Liu, but he couldn't, because thanking him would mean acknowledging the lie, would mean revealing that he understood Chinese, would mean exposing everything. So Morrison just nodded at Liu, and Liu smiled back, as if to say, "We soldiers take care of each other." The guilt was crushing.
The second close call came in November. A group of American POWs was being transported through Huirang. 12 captured soldiers being moved from a frontline prison camp to a more permanent facility near the Chinese border. Morrison saw them from a distance. American uniforms, dirty and torn, hollow eyes, thin bodies, hands bound. They were being marched through the village square under heavy guard. Every instinct in Morrison's body screamed at him to help them. These were his countrymen, his brothers in arms, men who were suffering in captivity while he lived in relative safety under false pretenses. But what could he do? If he revealed himself, he'd be captured too, and his information wouldn't help them. He had no intelligence of value, no escape plan that would work for a group. So Morrison did the hardest thing he'd ever done. He stood with the other Chinese soldiers and watched American POWs march past, and he did nothing. One of the prisoners looked directly at him. A young man, couldn't have been more than 20. The prisoner's eyes were dull, defeated. He glanced at Morrison in the Chinese uniform, and Morrison saw something flicker in those eyes. Not recognition, how could there be, but perhaps a kind of hopeless hatred for yet another enemy face. Morrison wanted to signal somehow, wanted to communicate. "I'm American too. I'm one of you. You're not alone." But he couldn't. He stood at attention like all the other Chinese soldiers, his face blank, his heart breaking. After the prisoners passed, Liu came up beside Morrison. Terrible, isn't it? The Americans. They're just men like us, just following orders. This war. Liu trailed off, shaking his head. Morrison realized something in that moment. Liu wasn't a true believer. Liu didn't hate Americans. Liu was just a young man who'd been conscripted into a war he didn't choose, forced to leave his family, forced to fight for political ideas he barely understood. In another world, Morrison and Liu might have been friends for real. They might have shared a beer, talked about life, complained about the weather. But in this world, Morrison was pretending to be someone he wasn't, and Liu was trusting someone who was lying to him. War had made them both prisoners in different ways.
The third close call, the worst one, came in January 1953. The winter was brutal that year. Temperatures dropped below zero. Snow piled up in drifts. The supply lines from China were disrupted. Food became scarce. In the barracks, men were getting sick. Influenza was spreading. Several soldiers had already died. The village had no doctor, only a medic with limited supplies. Morrison got sick too. This time it wasn't pretend. High fever, chills, coughing, real coughing, not the fake cough he'd been using. For 3 days, he lay on his mat, drifting in and out of consciousness. Liu brought him water, shared his food rations. The medic came once, listened to Morrison's chest, shook his head. "Nothing I can do. He either fights it off or he doesn't." On the third night, Morrison's fever broke. He woke up in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, his mind clearer than it had been in days. Liu was sitting beside his mat, keeping watch. "Chen Wei," Liu said softly. "You're awake. Good. I was worried." Morrison nodded weakly. Liu smiled. "You were talking in your sleep. Fevered dreams, I suppose." Morrison's blood ran cold. Talking in his sleep. What had he said? Had he spoken English? "You kept saying names. Betty, Sarah. Who were they? Family back home." Morrison's heart stopped. He'd said their names. In his delirium, he'd said Betty's name, Sarah's name, English names. He looked at Liu. Liu was watching him carefully. Too carefully. Did Liu know? Had he figured it out? The moment stretched. Morrison's mind raced. If Liu knew, if he suspected, what would happen? Would Liu report him or... "My sister's name is May. My mother is Lin. I dream about them too. This war, it steals everything from us. Even our dreams." Liu stood up. "Rest now, Chen Wei. You need your strength."
And he walked away. Morrison lay there, trembling, not from fever, but from fear.
Did Liu know? Had he just protected Morrison again? Or had he genuinely not realized that Betty and Sarah were foreign names? Morrison would never know for certain. But from that night on, Liu looked at him differently. Not with suspicion exactly, but with something else. Understanding, maybe, or sadness. They never spoke of it again. But something had changed between them. On July 27, 1953, the Korean War ended, not with a peace treaty, but with an armistice, a ceasefire, a line drawn across the peninsula dividing north from south. The news reached Hwoarang 3 days later. Soldiers gathered in the village square as officers read the announcement. There would be no more fighting. Troops would withdraw. Prisoners would be exchanged. Morrison stood in that crowd and felt nothing. No relief, no joy, just numbness. For 8 months, he'd been Chen Wei. For 8 months, he'd lived this impossible lie, and now the war was over, and he had no idea what came next. The American military would assume he was dead. His name was probably already on a memorial somewhere. Betty had probably mourned him, moved on. Sarah would grow up without knowing her father. And how could he go home? How could he explain what he'd done? He'd survived by pretending to be the enemy. He'd worn a Chinese uniform. He'd lived among them, worked alongside them. Would anyone believe he hadn't collaborated? Would anyone believe he hadn't betrayed his country? In the days following the armistice, the Chinese soldiers began to prepare to leave. They would march back across the border, into China. The village would empty. Life would return to whatever normal meant after 3 years of war.
Liu found Morrison 2 days before the Chinese departure. "Jianwei," he said, "walk with me." They walked to the edge of the village, to a small hill overlooking the valley. The snow was beginning to melt. Spring was coming, finally. Liu was quiet for a long time. Then he spoke. "I'm going home," he said. "Back to Guangdong. Back to my mother and sister. I don't know what I'll do there. Farm, probably. Try to forget this war." Morrison nodded. "You should go home too," Liu said. "Wherever that is, whoever you are." Morrison's breath caught. Liu did know. Liu had known, maybe for months. "I'm not going to ask," Liu continued. "I don't want to know the details, but I know you're not really Chen Wei. I've known for a while." Morrison wanted to speak, wanted to explain, but even now he couldn't risk it. "You saved yourself," Liu said. "However you did it, whatever choices you made, you survived. There's no shame in that. War makes us all do things we never imagined we could do." Liu reached into his pocket and pulled out a small object, a wooden carving of a bird. He'd carved it himself, Morrison knew. Liu was always carving things during his free time.
"Take this," Liu said. "Something to remember that not all Chinese soldiers were your enemies. Some of us were just men." Morrison took the carving. His hand was shaking. "Go home," Liu said. "Find Betty, find Sarah, live the life you were meant to live." And then Liu did something that nearly broke Morrison completely. He saluted. Not a Chinese salute, but an American salute. Crisp, respectful. Morrison returned the salute. It was the first American gesture he'd made in 8 months. Then Liu turned and walked away. They never saw each other again. Morrison waited until the Chinese soldiers had left. For 3 days after their departure, he stayed in character. Chen Wei helped with cleanup duties. Chen Wei followed the remaining orders. But the village was changing. North Korean officials were returning. Administrative control was being reestablished. Soon someone would notice that Private Chen Wei wasn't on any official roster, that his unit had returned to China without him. Morrison had to move, now. On the 4th night after the Chinese withdrawal, Morrison gathered what few supplies he had. He buried the Chinese uniform in the forest. He wouldn't need it anymore. He fashioned civilian clothing from scraps and stolen items. And then for the first time in 8 months, Morrison headed south, toward the DMZ, toward the newly established border between North and South Korea. The journey took 6 days. Morrison traveled at night, hid during the day. He avoided roads, stuck to forest and mountains. He was weak from months of inadequate rations. His body was different, thinner, harder, changed by the experience of survival.
Twice he encountered North Korean patrols. Both times he hid, barely breathing, until they passed. On the 6th night, Morrison reached the DMZ, the demilitarized zone, a strip of land 4 kilometers wide running across the entire peninsula. On one side, North Korea. On the other, South Korea and freedom. But the DMZ was heavily patrolled. Minefields had been laid. Fences were going up. Crossing would be deadly.
Morrison watched the patrols for 2 nights, learning their patterns. Then he found his moment. 3 a.m., a gap between patrol routes. The moon was dark. Visibility was low. Morrison ran. He sprinted across the frozen ground, every sense alert. He could hear his heart pounding, could hear his breath rasping. Any moment, a shout, a gunshot, an explosion. He crossed 100 meters, 200. The border had to be close now. Then he heard it. A voice shouting in Korean. A patrol had spotted him. Morrison ran faster. His lungs burned. His legs were screaming. Gunfire erupted behind him. Bullets whipped past his head. One hit the ground next to his feet, spraying up frozen dirt. He dove forward and rolled down a slope. At the bottom was a creek, frozen solid. He crawled across the ice, expecting at any moment to fall through, to drown, to die, so close to freedom.
But the ice held. On the other side of the creek, Morrison looked back. The North Korean patrol was at the top of the slope, but they weren't following, because the creek marked the border. Morrison was in the DMZ now, in no man's land. He had to keep moving. He crawled up the opposite slope, through mud and ice and darkness. And then, suddenly, there were voices ahead. Different voices. American voices. "Halt! Identify yourself!" A flashlight beam hit Morrison's face. He stood slowly, hands up. "Don't shoot," Morrison said in English. His voice was hoarse, rough from months of disuse. "Don't shoot. I'm American. I'm Captain James Morrison, United States Air Force." There was a moment of stunned silence. Then, "Jesus Christ! Get a medic over here! We've got a live one!" Hands pulled Morrison over a fence. American hands. Friendly hands. Captain James Morrison had made it home. The debriefing took 3 weeks. Morrison sat in a small room in Seoul and told his story to Air Force intelligence officers over and over again. Every detail, every decision, every moment of his 8 months behind enemy lands. The officers were skeptical at first. A pilot survives a crash, steals a Chinese uniform, lives among the enemy for 8 months, and simply walks out? It sounded like a fantasy. It sounded like a cover story for collaboration. But Morrison had details. He had knowledge of Chinese supply routes, troop movements, equipment. He had information about morale among Chinese soldiers, about their living conditions, about their orders. More importantly, he had Lear's carving, the wooden bird. It was proof that he'd been there, that he'd lived among them. The Air Force eventually concluded that Morrison was telling the truth, but they had a problem. "Mr. Morrison," the lead intelligence officer said, "what you did was remarkable, unprecedented. You survived in a way that no one thought possible. But we can't make this public." "Why not?" Morrison frowned. "Because of how you survived. You wore an enemy uniform. You lived as one of them. If this story gets out, it complicates things. The public won't understand. They'll ask questions about collaboration, about Geneva Conventions, about whether you should have tried to escape earlier." "I did what I had to do to survive," Morrison said. "We know. And between us, you made the right choices. But publicly, this story stays classified." "For how long?" "Indefinitely. Your family will be told you're alive, obviously. But the details of your survival? Classified." Morrison sat back. After everything he'd been through, after 8 months of pretending to be someone else, he was being told to keep pretending, to keep his truth hidden.
"What about my record?" he asked. "What will it show? That you were shot down, evaded capture, and made it back to friendly lines. That's all. The specifics remain classified." Morrison thought about Lou, about the friendship based on lies which somehow became real anyway, about the guilt he still felt for deceiving someone who'd saved his life multiple times. "I met a Chinese soldier, Private Liu Shen. He was a good man, just a kid really. He figured out who I was, but he never reported me. He protected me. When he went home to China, I don't even know if he survived the journey." The intelligence officer was silent for a moment. Then he said, "War makes strange companions sometimes. I hope he made it home safely." "Me too." Morrison returned to the United States in September 1953, a year and a month after he'd been shot down. Betty was waiting at the airport. She'd been told 2 weeks earlier that her husband was alive, but not how he'd survived. She ran to him when she saw him, threw her arms around him, wept against his chest. "I thought you were dead," she whispered. "They told me you were dead." "I'm here," Morrison said. "I'm home." But he wasn't, really. Part of him was still in Hoi Ring. Part of him was still Chen Wei, standing in formation, pretending to be someone else.
Betty pulled back and looked at him. "You're different," she said. "I know. Can you tell me what happened?" "No, it's classified." Betty searched his face. Then she nodded. "Okay, but you're home now. That's what matters." She turned and picked up a small child who'd been standing beside her. Sarah, 15 months old, dark hair, Betty's nose, Morrison's eyes. "Sarah," Betty said softly, "this is your daddy." Morrison looked at his daughter. This child he'd thought about every night for over a year. This child who'd kept him sane when Chen Wei became his only identity. Sarah stared at him with solemn eyes. Then she reached out one small hand and touched his face. "Daddy," she said. It was the first time Morrison had cried since being shot down. Morrison tried to return to normal life. He was assigned to a training base in California, teaching new pilots. He came home every night to Betty and Sarah. They had a son 2 years later, Michael. But Morrison wasn't the same man who'd left Cedar Rapids in 1951. The nightmares were constant. In his dreams, he was still in the barracks, still pretending, still afraid that any moment someone would discover the truth.
He couldn't talk about what had happened. Betty knew something had changed her husband, but she didn't know what. How could he explain? How could he tell her that he'd survived by becoming the enemy, that he'd stood by and watched American POWs march past and done nothing? The guilt was worst. Not guilt about survival. He'd made the right choices. He knew that intellectually. But guilt about Liu. Guilt about deceiving someone who'd shown him genuine friendship. Guilt about the lie that had saved his life. In 1955, Morrison left the Air Force. He couldn't fly anymore. Every time he got in a cockpit, he saw that moment when his plane was hit, when he had to choose between ejecting and trying to crash land. He got a job as a civilian flight instructor. It was quiet work, safe work. He taught teenagers how to fly Cessnas, far from combat, far from war. Betty asked him once in 1960 if he regretted staying in Korea, if he wished he'd tried to escape sooner. "No," Morrison said. "I did what I had to do. I survived. That's what matters." But late at night, lying awake while Betty slept, Morrison would take out Liu's wooden carving, the bird. He'd kept it all these years, hidden in a drawer. And he'd wonder, did Liu make it home? Did he find his mother and sister? Did he become a farmer like he'd planned? Morrison would never know. The war had separated them, different countries, different lives, different truths about what had happened in that village. But sometimes Morrison liked to imagine that Liu was somewhere in Guangdong, carving wooden birds, telling his children about the strange war he'd fought as a young man. And maybe, just maybe, Liu thought about Chen Wei sometimes, the quiet soldier with the cough who'd been his friend for a few months during the worst period of his life.
Two men, thrown together by war, separated by circumstances, connected by a friendship that was both real and impossible. Captain James William Morrison died in April 1993 at the age of 69. Cancer. He'd been sick for 6 months. His funeral was in Cedar Rapids, where he'd been born. Betty was there, elderly now, but still beautiful. Sarah was there with her husband and 3 children. Michael was there with his family, friends from the flight school, veterans from Morrison's Air Force days. The Air Force sent a representative to present Betty with a flag, the standard honors for a veteran. But then something unusual happened. A second Air Force officer approached Betty after the ceremony, a colonel with intelligence insignia on his uniform. "Mrs. Morrison," the colonel said, "I'd like to speak with you and your children about your husband's service record." They met in a private room at the funeral home. The colonel carried a briefcase. "Your husband's complete service record was classified for 40 years.
As of last year, 1992, that classification was lifted. You have a right to know what he did during the Korean War. And then the colonel told them everything. The crash, the decision to stay behind enemy lines, the 8 months living as a Chinese soldier, the friendship with Liu, the escape. Sarah listened with tears streaming down her face. "He never told us," she whispered. 40 years, and he never said a word. He was ordered not to, and I think he carried a lot of weight from that experience, a lot of guilt that he shouldn't have felt.
Betty was quiet. Then she said, "He used to have nightmares for years. He'd wake up speaking words I didn't understand, Chinese words, I realize now. He was reliving it." The colonel said, "What your husband did was extraordinary. He survived impossible circumstances through intelligence and courage. The Air Force has decided to award him posthumously the Silver Star for his actions." Michael spoke up. "He should have gotten it 40 years ago." "Yes," the colonel agreed, "he should have. But the times were different then. There were political considerations. We failed him. The Air Force failed him." The colonel opened his briefcase and pulled out a document. "There's one more thing. When we declassified his record, we sent inquiries to China through diplomatic channels. We were trying to verify details of his story." He handed the document to Betty. Her hands trembled as she read. Sarah leaned over her mother's shoulder. Liu Shen had survived the war. He'd returned to Guangdong province. He'd become a farmer, just as he'd planned. He married, had 3 children. He died in 1989. 4 years before Morrison. But there was more. In 1988, Liu had been interviewed for an oral history project about the Korean War. He'd mentioned a strange soldier he'd known briefly in Haering, someone he suspected wasn't really Chinese, someone he'd protected. "I never knew his real name. I never asked. But I hope he made it home safely. I hope he found his family." Betty was crying now. Sarah, too. Even Michael had tears in his eyes.
Your father and Liu Shen were enemies who became friends in a war where that should have been impossible. That's worth remembering. 2 months after Morrison's funeral, Sarah Morrison Shen, she'd married a Chinese-American man, coincidentally, traveled to Guangdong province with her husband. They found Liu's village. They met his children, adults now with families of their own. Through interpreters, Sarah told them about her father, about his survival, about the 8 months and worry, about the wooden bird carving that her father had kept in his drawer for 40 years. Liu's eldest son listened carefully. Then he smiled, a sad, understanding smile. "My father kept something too," he said. He went into his house and returned with a small box. Inside was a military patch, American, from a flight suit. It was weathered, worn, but still recognizable. "He found this in the forest in 1952, Liu's son explained, after an American plane crashed nearby. He never said why he kept it. We thought it was just a souvenir of the war. But now we know," Sarah finished. Liu's son gave her the patch. Sarah gave him the wooden bird carving. "Our fathers were friends in a war that tried to make them enemies. That's rare. That's special." Sarah nodded, unable to speak.
They planted a tree together that day, in Liu's village, a memorial to 2 men who'd found humanity in the midst of inhumanity, who'd chosen friendship over fear, who'd survived in their different ways and carried each other's memories for the rest of their lives. Captain James William Morrison survived 8 months behind enemy lines during the Korean War, living among Chinese soldiers under a false identity. His story remained classified until 1992. Private Liu Shen returned to China after the war and lived a quiet life as a farmer. He never revealed that he'd knowingly protected an American pilot. The wooden bird carving Liu gave Morrison is now in the Smithsonian National Air and Space Museum. Morrison's Silver Star was presented to his family in 1994. The tree planted by the Morrison and Liu families still grows in Guangdong province. This story is a reminder that even in war, humanity can prevail, that friendship can exist between enemies, and that the choices we make to survive are not the choices we can speak about,
but they are always the choices that define us.